Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
The topic of our conversation this time round is the triumphant underdog. It's got to have an exclamation mark after that because they don't seem to go together. Who are we talking about, Mike?
Oh, we're talking about a young 14-year-old boy who's got no training in warfare at all, who is going to overcome a trained 9-foot-tall champion, the guys we know as David and Goliath.
David and Goliath. Now, there's a story that so many people either know or think they know. You're talking about a David and Goliath situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When someone who seems so small or powerless overcomes someone or something that's hugely disproportionate to it, doesn't it?
And maybe we ought to just remind ourselves, this isn't a children's story.
No, not at all. This is a very real story recorded in the history section of the Bible in the early days of the monarchy. After Israel had entered the promised land, there's that period under Joshua's leadership where they take the land that God had promised them, followed by a period of rule by regional judges, which covers quite a long period, 300 plus years. And it's towards the end of that period that the Israelites are increasingly under pressure from a group of people called the Philistines, whom we've referred to previously. These were people who had migrated round the coast and had ended up settling in 5 cities along the coast of Canaan and who ruled the territory around them. So we often call them 5 city-states. But at the time of Israel's early monarchy, that's particularly the rule of King Saul and just going into King David, they were really pushing out for more territory, wanting to press into the land that belonged to the Israelites. And so this is a period where there are lots of clashes between the two as the Israelites find themselves faced with these Philistine warriors who were hugely better equipped than they were. They'd managed to get hold of the latest weapons of warfare, iron technology. This was cutting-edge weaponry. And so they were better equipped, better trained, stronger forces. So Israel really did find themselves under pressure at this time.
So there was a mismatch from the off.
Oh, absolutely. It was a David and Goliath from the beginning. There is no doubt that the Goliath, to where the power lay, was very much with the better equipped Philistines, and the Israelites were definitely the little David in that scenario.
So I think you said the Israelites, they had a king. That would be, what, Saul? Was he a strong leader?
Yes, he was. Initially, he was both a strong and godly leader appointed in response to the people's request to Samuel the prophet for a king. In fact, if I just read you a few verses from 1 Samuel chapter 8, we read that when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel, but his sons did not walk in his ways. Actually, they turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. Oh dear, so the implication is they're not going to be able to take over from him. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." That's interesting, such as all the other nations have. They could see that the nations around them seemed to be doing better than them. Why are they doing better than us? They reasoned. Well, it must be because they've all got a king and we don't. Of course, that wasn't the reason. The reason they weren't doing well is because they weren't living obediently to the King of Kings. They weren't following the word of the Lord. They weren't living according to the law, as we see reflected there in the way that even Samuel's own sons were taking bribes and they were supposed to be leaders and prophets. And so they think what we need is a king. And so they pressed Samuel to appoint them a king. He was very cross and very frustrated and very miffed, frankly, because he thought they were rejecting him. And God eventually warns the people in chapter 8 and says, well, look, here's a warning of what the king will do. And they all said, no, we want a king. This is really what we need. And eventually God had said to Samuel, okay, appoint the king for them, and had led them to this young man called Saul, who, as I said, initially started out as, well, a head and shoulders above all his brothers. He was strong. He was brave. He initially led his people into success. He had everything going for him, except he couldn't accept that as the king, he had a king over him. There was a God over him. And so we get a story in 1 Samuel chapter 13 where Samuel the prophet sets him a test of obedience, and he disobeys. He does what he thinks best. The Philistines are attacking. Samuel had promised to come. He doesn't turn up within the promised 7 days. Saul's men start scattering. So he thinks, well, I'm going to have to offer the sacrifice that Samuel said he would come and offer. And clearly there, we talked in a previous episode about trusting the things of God rather than the God of things. He was trusting, if only we offer the sacrifice, that will turn the battle. But Samuel says to him, you've acted foolishly. You know, if only you'd obeyed God, your kingdom would have endured forever. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart to succeed you. He gets a second chance in chapter 15, but likewise blows that, where once again Samuel confirms that God has taken the kingship from him. But kings, in fact, anyone in power, don't like to give up power too easily, do they? He doesn't step down. And so what we find in the remaining chapters of Samuel is that as King Saul slowly declines, both in ability and in mental health, a young man of God's choosing, a young man called David, is on the rise. In chapter 16, he's anointed by Samuel privately, just with his family, as the future king. And at the end of chapter 16, he's brought to Saul's service by, he had this great gift of being able to play a mean chord or two on a harp and sing songs that had a way of soothing Saul when he was in one of his manic phases. But of course, because he was in a depressed and manic phase, he didn't particularly remember the young lad. So it's in chapter 17 that David really now steps onto the more public scene in the incident that we'll look at today.
But he's been in the shadows and he's still a young man, and he's somehow caught up in this battle scene involving Goliath.
Yeah, very much. We think he was probably about 14 years old at this stage, you know. So it's that stage of life, isn't it, where you're no longer a boy. You think you're a man and can do everything a man can do, but you're not quite there yet. And that's the stage that he was at. And he does get, as it were, caught up simply by the fact that his dad sends him with supplies for his older brothers who are fighting there in the army against the Philistines. And
so he's not involved with the warfare in any way at 14 years of age?
Not at all. He's actually been left back at home to look after the sheep while his older brothers have gone to do the man stuff. So again, that shows you that certainly in the culture of that time, he's not yet seen as of sufficient age to be able to do the real stuff of life. You just look after the sheep and we'll go and fight the Philistines. And it's only because his dad sends him with some fresh supplies for his brothers that he even ends up on this battlefront at all.
And you can only imagine what's going through his mind as he arrives at the battle scene.
Yeah, I wonder what was going on. It was probably a mixture at that age, wasn't it, of apprehension and excitement that only youths can have. So it probably was quite exciting, the thought of going to the front, and yet it was also a pretty dangerous place to go. But he will turn up there at really quite a crucial moment.
But he knows that he's actually been anointed to become the next king.
Yes, that's happened, hasn't it, in the previous chapter, like we said. Samuel's poured oil over him and God has said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. And then it says, as Samuel did that, from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came on David in power. But then nothing. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes still today, God calls us to things and then it's followed by nothing. There's those times of waiting, and David will certainly experience waiting. He'll experience many years of waiting to come to what God has promised for him. So it's there, but, it's at the back of his mind. I'm sure he wouldn't have thought of this situation of anything to do with that particularly. It was just one of those, well, that was a nice prophetic word. Not quite sure how that one's going to work out. And then his dad suddenly says, here, take this food to your brothers, will you? And they were probably two quite parallel thoughts, I would imagine, at that time.
So how on earth did he end up on the front line?
It's a strange thing because he turns up to hear some of Goliath's boasts and taunts. So let's just rewind the tape a little, because some things have been happening in the 40 days prior to David turning up at the battlefront. Now, in the ancient world, there was a thing called battle by champion. And what that was, it was a way of saving bloodshed, really. And rather than having two armies fighting one another with all the bloodshed that would bring, the two opposing armies would often agree, okay, you appoint a champion, we'll appoint a champion, they can fight it out against one another, and whoever wins, it will be deemed that side has won, and the other side will yield to him. So that's how it was settled, and that's what happens in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. The Philistines come forward and suggest, rather than this sort of dogfight that had been going on between them, that they settle the issue through battle by champion. So far, so good. But there was a problem for the Israelites in that the Philistines' champion was 9 feet tall and equipped with incredible armour and weapons. So it really didn't look like an even battle at all, even from the start. Let me read you just a few verses to bring that out. So this is 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's pretty heavy, by the way. It's about 125 pounds. And on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung across his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point, notice that iron is new, we're just coming into the Iron Age here. His iron point weighed 600 shekels, that's about 15 pounds, and his shield bearer went ahead of him. So, this is a complete mismatch, isn't it? This is like, how on earth are we going to bring anyone out against this guy? And then he comes forward day after day for 40 days, shouting to the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. There's the battle by champion I referred to. Then the Philistines said, this day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. But on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And I think we can understand why, can't we?
Well, when it said over 9 feet tall.
They're on a loser from the beginning, aren't they? So little wonder that over the 40 days, no one has volunteered. You can imagine the king perhaps turning around, use a bit of godly imagination at times when reading the Bible. The king turning around every day and saying, okay, any volunteers? Anyone? Any of my captains wanting to do this? And them all coughing and looking at their feet. No one was going to take on this guy.
So Goliath is almost the champion without anything happening.
Yes, until this little underdog comes along. Until David comes along carrying the provisions for his brothers that his father has sent him with and hears this for the first time. So let's read a bit more of the story. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" Oh, listen to that. There's a sense here that this is bringing disgrace on the people of God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Stressing there the uncircumcised. He's not part of the people of God. Who is this man who's standing against the people of God? So, they tell him what it's all about. Of course, his brothers just think, he's being a cocky little young brother, and what on earth have you come down here for, just full of conceit and arrogance, and you've just come to see what's happening in the battle and make fun of everybody. And David says, "Now, what have I done?" So there's some real sort of brotherly interaction going on here between the two of them. But someone overhears what David said. There was something about his words. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He's overheard. It's reported to Saul, and Saul sends for him. And we read that David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine." And here's the surprise. "Your servant will go and fight for him." Now, 14-year-old lad, probably at this stage, at that sort of mixture of thin and lanky as they're moving from boyhood to manhood. One can imagine the sniggers going around the officers at that point, can't we?
And he wasn't dressed for battle.
Absolutely not. Saul says to him, "You can't go out and fight him. You're only a boy." And he's been a fighting man from his youth, let alone not having the right equipment. But I love what follows then. David says to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Wow, what a declaration there, not about how good he is, but about how big his God is. And he goes back, whenever we're facing difficulties in life, can you go back and recall what God has done for you in the past? That's what David does. He remembers how God has given him the strength and ability to overcome wild animals when they've attacked his sheep, and how just with his sling, he's been able, with God's help, to fight them off. Of course, like you said a couple of moments ago, David, he's not equipped to go and do this. So the first thing that Saul wants to do is to give him his armor. Who's got the best armor in the Israelite army? The king has. So he gives him his own armor. It says he put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened his sword over his tunic, and he tried walking around in them because he wasn't used to them. And he ends up saying, "I can't go in these because I'm not used to them." The armor just doesn't fit. Maybe it was too big, it's too clunky, he's not accustomed to it. Just in passing, let's say, you can't fight battles in other people's armor. You've got to learn how to fight them in the armor that God has given you. You can't win a spiritual battle by pretending to be someone that you've seen on Christian TV or heard on radio. You have to be who God has made you and use the weapons that God has given you, because if not, you will be like David in Saul's armor and clunking along and completely unable to do anything.
Another surprise for me is that the atmosphere must have changed when King Saul even gave the impression that David should have a chance. I mean, he's surrounded by his own men, and there's a 14-year-old boy there.
Yeah, I wonder what was going on in everyone's mind. I suppose in Saul's mind, was it that something about what David had said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Had it touched something spiritual within him? Maybe. I think it's more likely in the bigger sweep of what we see happening to Saul by this point that he thought he'd nothing to lose.
Last resort.
Yeah, and I suspect the soldiers around were just sniggering and thinking, well, this is a waste of time. But remember, this is battle by champion. So this is, if we get this wrong, if this lad does not beat the Philistine, all of us now are under the overlordship of the Philistines. We are now their servants, their slaves. So this was not just, oh, well, we lost that one, didn't it? The whole thing depends on this one battle between two people. So what was going on in their minds at this moment, heaven only knows.
But I think you've highlighted that the conceited arrogance of Goliath versus the holy confidence of young David is actually what the battle's about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that becomes even clearer as David now goes out to battle, because what he does is he takes off the armour that he can't walk in and he picks up the armour that he can walk in. And the armour that he can walk in is something very simple. It's a slingshot, a catapult, and 5 smooth stones. Why 5? Well, quite simply, archaeologists have found the shots that were used in slingshots like this. They're about the size of cricket balls. So if you imagine about 5 of those in a pouch by your side, that would be about the maximum number that you'd be used to having. And he goes and he takes his pouch with his 5 stones. He takes his slingshot. He uses the weaponry that he knows he can use and that God has used in the past. And of course, as David goes out to the Philistine and sees this young lad coming out to him, well, he not only laughs, he is profoundly offended. He says, "Am I a dog that you come out at me with sticks?" And then says to David, "Come here, I'll give you flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." So clearly he's utterly despising of this underdog, angry that he's been sent against him. And then these powerful words that David says to the Philistine: "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Note that. That's who David wants to get glory out of this. Not him, not Saul, not Israel, but the God who is in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. Wow, what a fantastic statement. And it's at that point that we read that Goliath now moves towards David to attack him. He's clearly outraged, absolutely livid, outraged. You can imagine his face red with anger as he comes to take one swipe with his sword or spear against this young lad. But we read that David ran quickly towards him, doesn't run away from him, runs toward him, and he reaches into his bag and he takes out a stone and he slings it round his head and lets go of one side of the leather straps, and the stone flies through the air and lands, bang, straight in the middle of the Philistine's head. And of course, a ball about the size of a cricket ball or a baseball traveling at that speed would really knock someone out. And so the guy slumps to the ground. It's not that kills him, as many Christians end up erroneously thinking. All that did was knock him out, so that David then runs towards him and takes Goliath's sword and uses it and cuts off his head. Now, that's a pretty gruesome part of the story for our modern Western sensibilities, isn't it? But takes his head and holds it up so that everyone can know who is the champion. And at that point, when the Philistines see that their champion, their hero, is dead, they turn and run, and then the Israelite soldiers, of course, chase after them all the way back to their home cities and win an incredible victory through this triumphant underdog.
Is there a sense in which David didn't just hit Goliath at his weakest point physically, but actually attacked him and all that he represented spiritually?
Yes, very much so. I think he attacked him at a whole number of levels. One is the physical, one is, if you like, the psychological, but one is definitely the spiritual, and that's the one that predominates in this story again and again. What we see here is not David boasting about what he's done as a young boy with his slingshot. Yes, he tells Saul that because he wants to give God glory of how God has helped him in the past. But the focus throughout this is the Lord. The Lord will give me victory. The Lord who's trained my hand. And I think there was probably something in that irritated and provoked the whole person of Goliath. Maybe there was something even that provoked the spirit within Goliath to see that he was coming up against here a man who was sold out for the living God and in whose presence, remember, we've seen in chapter 16 that the Spirit of the Lord came on David from that moment. So there was something about this lad, and I think there's definitely a spiritual encounter going on here, not just a physical one or even a psychological one.
And it sounds like from what he said, the reason why he was doing what he did, David that is, that in a sense he wouldn't want to be remembered for this battle. He would want God to be remembered.
Yes, absolutely. That's his sole desire. Funny, isn't it, therefore, that it gets a whole chapter, one of the longest stories in the book of Samuel. It was very much remembered, and it's maybe a lesson there that when we don't want to be remembered and just quietly get on with what God has given us, that we end up being remembered for that very thing. But David's passion here is for the opposite of what Saul had been. Remember, Saul by now has been rejected by God as king. Why? For disobedience, for wanting to put his kingship above God's kingship, wanting to be top dog, and forgetting that there is always someone above you, even when you are king. Contrast that with this young boy who is having incredible success, but wants glory to go not to him, but only to God, even though the memory of this and glory will come to him through it, even though he wasn't looking for it at all.
So our title, The Triumphant Underdog, sums up the story. You've read this story, I'm sure, many times. It's a very, very familiar story, the story of David and Goliath. What to you comes out of it in a fresh way this time?
I think the thing that stood out as I read this story was the whole point of you can't fight in someone else's armour. You know, each of us has to face battles. They're not facing Goliaths in our life, 9-foot-tall giants, but each of us in our own way in our own life has our own Goliaths, our own things we have to face, and sometimes they are people, and sometimes they're spiritual powers, and sometimes they're human constructions, and sometimes they're obstacles of different kinds. We all have Goliaths we face, but we cannot overcome them by wearing someone else's armour. I saw so-and-so on TV recently, and he did this. I'll try it. You know what? When that happens, there's just no hope for us at all. It's like we are left like David, clunking around in Saul's armour. What we need to do is to say, what has God gifted me, and what has God given me? What have I seen God do through me in the past? And how could I step out and trust God to use me again? So I think the big thing that stands out for me in this story from the triumphant underdog is not to try to fight in someone's armour, but to trust whom God has made you and the gifts God has given you. And in all you do, if you truly want to be the triumphant underdog, is to make sure that in everything you are constantly looking to give praise and glory to God and not attracting it to yourself.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.